The Lionel Gelber Prize is awarded every year to the best book on international affairs. To mark the 25th anniversary, we spoke with 5 Gelber winners. I asked them how the world has changed. My name is John Stackhouse, and here is what I learned. We're here in New York, and I'm joined by Walter Russell Mead, author of Special Providence. Walter, good to see you.
Great to be here.
I'd like to start by taking you back to 1990, a period of, or a point of time that was full of optimism for the world. And looking back over the last 25 years, there's certainly the world was dominated by a U.S. worldview. Do you think the world has been better for that?
I remember the night the Berlin Wall fell, or the morning after. I was actually in Rio and was sitting at a cafe having a cup of coffee, a cafezinho in the morning, and was trying to, with my terrible Portuguese, trying to make out what the newspaper headline was. It showed these people on top of the Berlin Wall. The headline was, O triunfo do capitalismo, the triumph of capitalism. And as I was reading this, one of the little street kids who lives in the favela near the beach, I felt a tug at my coat. I looked down and this, about a 4-year-old child was begging for the scraps of my breakfast. So I thought, well, maybe the triumph of capitalism isn't completely finished yet. That episode has stayed with me over the last 25 years, that at one level we've been hailing this, really epical transformation of the global stage, and yet we've been haunted by the reality that a lot of the problems that we face have not been solved.
Has the world become more like America?
Yes, and America's also become more like the world. I had a Thai friend was once complaining to me, do you realize there are 25 McDonald's in Bangkok, this cultural imperialism? I just looked at him and said, do you have any idea how many Thai restaurants there are in New York? I think what we're actually seeing is, thanks to the internet, thanks to sort of global commerce, migration, flows of people, we're all, even in America, we're in a much more global world. Now, a lot of that bears an American imprint and a kind of the stamp of this American capitalist corporate system. The golden arches, do get there first. But the global civilization that exists is something that goes beyond America and is certainly changing America too.
The Special Providence that you write about, how has it weathered the 25 years?
Well, it's been, The Special Providence is a book about how American foreign policy almost always looks cretinously stupid. And yet over time, in the longer run, America seems to do not a bad job of getting its national interests served in the international context. I'd say the last 25 years look to be not a bad example of that phenomenon.
Has the world become more comfortable with that sense of providence?
It's interesting. Again, the world since 1990, I think international perceptions and in the U.S. of American power have been almost bipolar. The superpower that can do anything, the failed power that can do nothing. And so I think you see this kind of bipolar modulation, while the reality of American power doesn't seem to me to be changing all that much. So after the 2008 financial crash, we had another one of these, America is finished. In some ways, the Chinese believed that more than other people and really launched a much more assertive foreign policy on the basis of that assumption. But a few years later, they're modifying that and kind of saying, well, maybe American power is actually here longer than we thought.
Now, much can change, but in 2015, has that relationship found a balance, America and the world?
One of the funny things about American power and the American presence in the world is that it's both status quo oriented and conservative, but also radical and revolutionary. So, as a leading global power, the United States is a status quo custodian of the international order. And yet at the same time, the capitalism that's the foundation of American society's wealth and power is a revolutionary force that transforms relations between nations and transforms social conditions within nations. so that American power is inherently not a calming force in the world. It never has been, and I don't think it is now.
Let me take you back through the three administrations that we've seen through this quarter century, starting with the Clinton administration. The Wilsonian side of the Clinton years fell short of expectations. Why was that?
Well, I think, like a lot of people who get elected president of the United States, when Clinton took office, he didn't have an accurate perception of how resistant elements of the international system are to change. So I think he very much, for example, overestimated America's ability to force human rights concessions on China using economic diplomacy. And so there were a couple of experiments along the way, and then I think looking at Bosnia-Kosovo, where ultimately the Clinton administration ended up taking a fairly interventionist posture. The more they looked at that situation, the more complicated it was, the more dangerous it was, the less they really wanted to get involved. So, I think this was a process of just trial and error, of realizing it sounds so easy. Well, we should never allow a genocide to take place. What could be simpler than that? Well, how many troops are we going to send to Rwanda, and how fast? Particularly right after we've had all that trouble, in Somalia with sending troops overseas. Do we really want to get, how many troops, how many casualties are we willing to face in order to restore a democratic government? Probably not a very effective democratic government to Haiti.
Let me take you to the Bush years. Obviously, 9/11 redefined the Bush administration. Initially after 9/11, enormous public support for the president and his policies quickly waned. How do you explain that now with more hindsight, that President Bush W lost much of the American public?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember it didn't wane actually that quickly. He was reelected by a substantially larger vote than the first time around. So it's really only in about 2005, 2006 that public opinion turned away from that. And he was actually in full control of American Iraq policy right up to the day he left office. Congress was never, even after he lost the midterm elections in 2006, the Democratic Congress was never actually able to pass a single resolution tying his hand in Iraq. Right after 2001, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that what you're now going to see would be that the President of the United States was going to have this massive force of enraged public opinion, a kind of a Pearl Harbor effect. We've been attacked. The entire country would rally around him as he went to avenge the attacker and make sure that it never happened again. And he really did. He had an amazing opportunity at that point to shape an American consensus. The best similar example would be Franklin Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor. And again, Roosevelt, if you think about his strategic choices, it was Japan that attacked the United States, but the choice that Roosevelt imposed on the public was Europe first. Yes, it was Japan that attacked us in Pearl Harbor, but for strategic reasons, we're going to go after Adolf Hitler, who hadn't at that point attacked us. So, in that sense, when Bush responds to an attack from Afghanistan, first with the war in Afghanistan, but then an attack on Iraq, there were a lot of people in American public opinion who sort of, are willing to give a president the benefit of the doubt in time of war. But then it was when, the weapons of mass destruction weren't found, which really, whatever people like Paul Wolfowitz and some others may have sort of said in the think tanks, the public case for why we needed a war with Iraq now was very much related to this imminent threat of WMD. When that didn't turn up, but also then when the predictions about how easy it would be to transform Iraq and when didn't come true, and when we were stuck in this long war that didn't seem to have a clear endpoint. At that point, people lost confidence, I think, in Bush's strategic judgment. And from there on, you still had a public determination to sort of tough the war out. And they were unwilling to see Congress block him from trying the surge. But they weren't, I think American public wasn't particularly grateful to Bush for the surge. They said, you've saved us from maybe a disaster in Iraq, but the only reason we needed to be saved was because you were there. So he didn't get thanked for winning a war that people by that time wish he hadn't started. So the support for the war on terror, so-called, was, I think, remained strong in the sense that even today, it looks to me as if both parties are more worried about being seen to do too little to protect the American people from this external threat than they're worried about doing too much or being seen as doing too much. But the question of what's the strategy to be adopted, that's where it seems to me there's a lot of public doubt, and where neither party, maybe to this point, has succeeded in advocating a strategy that people have confidence in.
If we can turn to the Obama administration, he certainly campaigned in 2008 against Bush, certainly against Bush's first term on foreign policy, and has shifted significantly in terms of his own foreign policy. How would you categorize Obama today?
Well, he's, like all, I think, of our recent presidents, he's learned a lot in office and has had to rethink some things. I think he came to power with actually a fairly well thought through grand strategy. He was going to liquidate the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as quickly as possible. He hoped that an outreach to, quote, moderate Islamists in the Middle East would sort of would undercut al-Qaeda and the jihadis by promoting an attractive ideological alternative that could still work with the West. So Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, AK Party in Turkey, and similar forces. And then at the same time, he would, taking advantage of the peace that seemed to be existing in Europe and the liquidation of the two wars, he would reduce the American defense budget overall while still having a little bit to build up in Asia, the pivot to Asia or the rebalance. And that was a strategy that looked as if it could reduce America's wars but also secure American interests. I think now in the second term, what he's coping with, like many presidents do, are the unforeseen consequences of the strategic choices made in the first term. So Putin is clearly not as pacified in Europe as was thought, and instead of pivoting away from Europe, the U.S., President Obama is now looking, how do I shore things up in Estonia, what do I do with Ukraine, and so on. The moderate Islamists in the Middle East have not been able to sort of bear the weight American policy wanted to place on them, so that in many ways with the rise of ISIS, the wars in the Middle East have gotten worse. And so President Obama is having to do, I think, much more about terrorism than he expected to be doing at this point, and is facing some very, very unpleasant strategic choices in places like Iraq and Syria. And meanwhile, in Asia, he still needs to keep responding to China in Asia. So what we're seeing is, in a sense, both Presidents Clinton and Presidents Bush came to office saying, we're going to downgrade American foreign policy, spend less, still do what needs to be done. President Obama actually also came with that same message and same hope. And like the two others, he's just found himself operating in a very unexpected world.
Of the four schools that you document in Special Providence, which would you say is in the ascendancy today?
I think probably ever since 9/11, the Jacksonian school, Andrew Jackson school, has been the sleeping giant in American politics that was woken up by 9/11. And this sense of the homeland is in danger and our politicians need to do what must be done has been a dominant force. The Jacksonians backed Bush. Then the Jacksonians sort of became disillusioned with the consequences of the strategy. And there was a period of time, and this went through maybe the 2008 election, when a lot of people thought the Jacksonians had gone back to sleep. And in fact, people talked about maybe there was going to be a Jeffersonian age of American isolationism. And politicians like Rand Paul were talking about the need to dramatically scale back. You know, why is America caring about the Middle East or Korea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But then, you know, with the rise of ISIS and the sort of reawakening of a sense of threat in the American public, I think we saw that the Jacksonians were just dozing. They weren't in a deep sleep. And so since the summer of 2014, we seem to be back in a period where the politics of American foreign policy are dominated by a sense of threat.
The Hamiltonians must be beside themselves, drifting further and further from mainstream America, or mainstream America is drifting further from them.
Yes and no. You know, the Hamiltonians, since there may even be some of your readers who haven't read Special Providence, Hamiltonians are people who take an inspiration from Alexander Hamilton, George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, who tried to adapt traditional British foreign policy to American circumstances, you know, of a strong federal government that worked closely with big corporations and economic interests to advance American economic and financial interests worldwide in the service of the power of the American state. And I actually think we're seeing a bit of a reinvention of Hamiltonianism, call it digital Hamiltonianism, where companies like Google and other information age companies are far more closely connected to the state than maybe many people realize. And that if you think about the revolution in military affairs, the role of data processing and intel, actually information in the modern age is one of the major sources of state strength. And the close connections between Silicon Valley and Washington have actually had a lot more to do with American policy and in some ways with America's economic resurgence than many people would understand. The other thing about contemporary American situation that makes Hamiltonians very happy is the rise of new energy sources, where the United States is and particularly along with Canada, despite the problems that come with the fall in oil prices more recently, both of these countries are poised to reshape global energy markets well into the 21st century. Again, from the Hamiltonian point of view of statecraft, this is an example of the core elements of American strength renewing themselves and surprising people who are predicting a kind of imminent end to American power.
Over the last quarter century, America has been the world's dominant thought leader in technology, certainly, mass culture, academic work as well. Is the world comfortable with that, and is America comfortable with that?
People, everyone around the world seems very happy to have iPads and things. No one is complaining about that. But certainly if you talk to people in the European Union, there's a concern both about the power of specific companies like Google and also the question of what is the role of the American high-tech sector compared to the European sector. In China, there is even more of a sense that there's a Chinese cybersphere that is in some kind of conflict with an American cybersphere. And so that Chinese companies and American companies their competition in some ways reflects a competition between states and even peoples. On the other hand, I think when it comes to academic ideas, if I go to a Chinese university and talk about international relations, I'll find that they and I are working with much more a common set of ideas and language even than we would have been 15 or 25 years ago. This sort of surge in American technology, ideology, and other things has had many different impacts, and people around the world respond in very complex ways to it.
Does the American public still want to transform the world?
Now, there are 330 million and everyone would give their own answer. But I think the reality is that simply by being America, the United States acts in ways that inevitably involve transformation of other societies. Sometimes I say to people that Al Gore destabilized the Middle East more by inventing the internet than George Bush destabilized it by invading Iraq. That in some ways America's impact on the rest of the world is the greatest when we aren't even thinking about, oh, how do I bring democracy to some far-flung country. Instead, I'm just wondering about how do I have a better way of sending email to the person in the lab across town. So that transformation is less something that's adopted as an agenda by foreign policy elites than it is a consequence of technological and social and economic change that just proceeds from Americans going about their daily business.
If you can look ahead to the next 25 years, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic?
I feel both. I am optimistic that there are going to be new technologies, that we are going to continue to see hundreds of millions of people around the world escape lives of absolute poverty. We're going to see things that we've seen like the fall in the death rate of malaria, rise in childhood literacy, these kinds of things. I think we can reasonably expect to see more of the same. It's likely that life expectancies will continue to lengthen in the advanced world, other things. I suspect even on some of the things people are very pessimistic about, like the climate change and environmental stuff, my guess is that a combination of new technologies and new ways of organizing society will provide surprising answers to some problems that now seem overwhelming. But at the same time, I think we're going to see many societies around the world experiencing deep and radical social dysfunction and alienation. I think we will continue to see people drawn to movements of extremism and protest. I think we will see governments in some parts of the world resorting to terrible violence, either against their own people or perhaps to neighbors. So we're going to see both of these things. In that sense, what I think technology does to human history is it turns up the volume. It doesn't necessarily change the content of the message, but it means that both the good and the bad are at a greater amplitude than they used to be.
If you look ahead to the next 25 years, are you optimistic about America's special providence and it continuing?
Well, the phrase comes from something that Otto von Bismarck is supposed to have said when he said that God must have a special providence for drunks, fools in the United States of America. And I imagine that America will still be needing some kind of special providence 25 years from now, and I certainly hope that it will be there for us and for our neighbors and friends.
Walter Mead, thank you for your time.
Thank you.